I recently played in a classical over-the-board chess tournament in Austria, and in this video I'm going to be running through a game which I played against a strong opponent, rated over 100 points higher than me, and what I learned from the experience, and what you can learn from it too. I think it's always fascinating to look at how stronger players think, and then try and build some of that into our own play. So keep watching and you'll learn the lessons that I learnt the hard way. My name's Nathan Rose, I'm the author of Chess Opening Names. If you're not already subscribed to my channel, please hit the subscribe button. I do all kinds of content on chess, including game reviews, but also tips on how to improve, reviews of my favourite software, and plenty more. So I've got black here, and we start off with a Sicilian defence. White goes for the open Sicilian, and by playing d4 very quickly, we get this immediate structural imbalance. So White's got a strong knight in the centre and this pawn on e4, whereas black in the long term has got the central pawn majority. We've traded the white d pawn for the black c pawn. So black can also think about some pressure along the c file if you can get a rook to c8, but that's all quite far in the future. Knight f6 attacks the pawn on e4, white defends, and a6. So this is called the knight-off variation. The idea of a6 is that you stop a white piece from arriving on b5. Sometimes a bishop, sometimes a knight coming to b5 can be quite annoying, so you just stop that straight away. And bishop to e2 is called the Opashensky variation. Now my way of playing against this is with e5. We'll run through the rest of the opening pretty quickly because the interesting part of the game is in the middle game, but all these moves are quite normal. And we've got the battle lines drawn now at this point, I would say. So the d5 square is a weak square that white can target. Can look at putting a knight there, and that's why I'm putting a lot of defenders against that square. Okay, so the knight on f6 and the bishop on e6 are all defending the d5 square. Black would like to play the d5 advance at some point, whereas white wants to prevent that. This is the main middle game pawn break where if black can get d5 in, black is often quite a lot better because of fixing the backward pawn weakness and opening up the position. Okay, so white is looking to add pressure to d6, understandably. Okay, going to bring a rook over to d1 to add more pressure to d6. So this makes the bishop on e7 a very important defensive piece for this d6 pawn until we can play d5 hopefully in the future. So like I say, more pressure coming along the d file, so I get the queen onto c7, which is the usual square for it. And now white plays knight to d5. Now when white does this, the idea is that white knows that you're going to capture this knight, and you have to take back with the pawn, right? So let's just show this. This is how the game continued. So this pawn on d5 now means that the d6 pawn from black is no longer weak because, well, there's a pawn in the way of white's own colour, so you can't really target the d6 pawn easily anymore. But what white has got instead is this outpost on c6. So white will try and bring the knight in to the c6 outpost from where it's quite annoying. Okay, I've played against the knight off myself with white, and I know that this is a standard idea. Put a pawn on d5 and then try and get a knight into c6. So rook a to c8, and now white goes for this plan. But in this particular case, this is actually a mistake because there's a tactic here. The knight is defended by the queen, but the queen is also defending the pawn. So by taking the pawn, well, if white takes back the knight, which is what happened in the game, then you take white's knight, and black has won a pawn. So the game's gone very well for me so far. I'm a pawn up already. Honestly, it's quite surprising that my opponent would allow such a simple tactic. Right, he's rated almost 1900, and that's just a two-move sequence. But as I say many times before on this channel, simple tactics can win a lot of games, even at pretty high levels of chess. The other thing about what's just happened here, this little sequence where the white queen is overloaded, both defending the pawn on d5 and the knight on a5, is that it's not just a simple tactic, but it's also a thematic tactic. This is something that I've seen many times before because I've got experience playing this opening. Like, it's not exactly the opening anymore. We're not reciting memorized moves, but this is the early middle game. And the thing about the early middle game is that the configuration of pieces is still similar enough that there are certain tactics which you can be on the lookout for. So I guess my opponent would have been quite shaken to allow this because it's something that I guess he would have seen before. Certainly I've seen it many times before. So he plays c4. Can't take that one because you'd lose the queen. And I react with knight to f6, gaining initiative that attacks the queen. But when you play such a move, you need to think about what your opponent is going to react with. Like, it's not just enough to be the one creating threats, because you need to look at, well, where's the queen going to go after this? Because it might go to a square where it creates an even bigger threat still. And I expected my opponent's next move, which is queen to b7. Now I needed to be aware of what to do here, so I did have my next move ready, and that was rook to c7, putting the question to the queen. And then again I was thinking about what is my opponent going to do next, and again I expected white's reply, bishop to b6. So we're entering into a line now where really the queens have to come off. If I move the queen out of the way, then I'd lose the rook. So I take the white queen, white takes my queen, I take this pawn, white takes back, and now I take on b2. And I had calculated all the way back several moves ago that white can't take this pawn on a6 because of the follow-up, rook to a8. Now these two bishops are skewered, I suppose you could call it. One of the bishops is going to get lost anyway. And bishop to c3, trying to win the tempo back, doesn't work because you can play rook to c2. And one of those white bishops is a goner, and black will be a piece up. So when I had captured on b2, I thought this is going fantastically well for me because I'm 2 pawns up now. Remember, he can't take this one. So with an extra 2 pawns, I'm well on my way to victory, right? But then my opponent hit me with a surprising move. Try and put yourself in white's shoes here. Like, what would you do? It looks very bad for white, right? Being 2 pawns down for a start. And also this rook is well placed on the second rank. White's move here was bishop to b3. Okay, I didn't see that coming. And the idea is that this rook is now quite short of squares. White's idea is going to be to play bishop to c3, and then where does the rook go? It's really running very short on squares, actually. What I thought about here was playing d5, which actually would have been the best move. It looks like a pawn sacrifice at first because you take here, and you've given one of the pawns back, but now this rook is going to be able to get out again. But actually d5 is an even better move, not for the reason that I just showed, which is also good for black, by the way. But after d5, if white takes here, then you actually, again, can fork the 2 bishops. This one's attacked once by the rook, this one's attacked twice by the rook and the knight, and white can't save both of them. So d5 would have been a great way to go, but what I did instead was I played rook to c8. So that has a good idea to it. It prevents bishop to c3, which was the problem. But then white played a very simple move, which made me think for a long time, and I really should have seen this coming, which is just simply rook to c1, challenging this rook on the open file. Amazingly, even though white is down 2 pawns in this position, the engine's evaluation is that the position is equal. And I think it's instructive to look at why this is. Why is it that despite white's material deficit, is white not worse? Well, it's all down to the activity of white's pieces. In particular, this light squared bishop is a star piece. It has pressure on f7 and the black king behind it. Also, just as importantly, the white bishop controls the c2 square. I would have loved to have reacted to white's last move, rook c1, by bringing my own rook up to c2 to keep the c-file blocked. But because of this bishop, that isn't possible. If you trade rooks, then white's also got control of the c-file. It could come into c8, it could also come into c7. And if you move the rook away with a move like rook to b8, then you have to consider, well, what happens if the white rook comes into c7 with pressure on this bishop, and if the bishop moves, then the f7 pawn could become a target, right? So imagine a rook on c7 and this f7 pawn coming under fire. Actually, rook to c7 is a blunder. The reason for that is that black can play bishop to d8. So I needed to calculate one more move, clearly. The thing is, if you take this pawn with the rook, then you can capture this bishop. And then once white takes back, then you pick up the rook. Count the material, black is a piece up. If white instead takes on f7 with the bishop, with check, then you can just calmly move out of the way. And this skewer means that, again, white is losing material. Move the rook out of the way and you lose the bishop, or leave the rook where it is and you're down the exchange. So I didn't play rook to b8, but this would have been the best move. Psychologically, this is a tough move to make as well. What I did instead is I took the rook. I took on c1, and then I played g6 to give my king an escape square, but this forgot about the other problem. The other problem, that this rook on b2 is still in danger of getting trapped as well. So I've got a lot of problems to solve here, and it actually turns out that I can't solve all of them. The best move here for white is to play bishop to c3 immediately. Now, it might seem as though the rook can get away, escape, but actually after king to f1, it's not safe. You can play rook to e3, bishop to d2, and then if the black rook moves away, it's not to keep trying to trap the rook, it's actually to come in with bishop to h6, with now a very scary and pretty much terminal threat of rook to c8, which is going to lead to checkmate or a massive loss of material. So my opponent didn't see all of that, and instead played king to f1 with the same kind of idea of trapping this rook, but this would have given me a way out of my predicament. Black has one move here to avoid losing, and can you see the move? How do you solve this problem? The next move that's coming is bishop to c3, and if white can play bishop to c3, then the rook's trapped. The move which I didn't find is knight to d5. So if you play bishop to c3 now, then that's okay, we can just trade, and the black rook is not in so much danger anymore. You can always play rook to d2, I suppose, because the dark squares are no longer under white's control. And in the critical line, what if you take the knight? Well, then you've got this fork. That was the way out. That was the one way out that I could have found to prevent losing the exchange. I didn't find that, and as a result, I ended up losing the rook. I played d5 instead. It seemed to me that bishop to c3 was unstoppable. I didn't find the knight to d5 resource. So d5 at least, I thought, well, it gets this central pawn majority going. I've got a pass pawn, maybe I'll have enough compensation. Of course, bishop to c3 comes, so I've got to give up the exchange. But it turns out that I don't have enough here. I do have 2 pawns for the exchange, but this pawn here is going to very quickly be lost, as we'll see. So I keep trying to move these pawns forward. This is my one and only chance. But white plays rook to c6, and there's no way to defend this pawn. If you advance it, like I did in the game, then the bishop takes it. And you've got to now try and move these pawns forward, but white's got a passed pawn of his own now. And this check isn't too scary. White can just defend. I tried defending the knight, but it's actually quite hard to get these pawns to move much further forward. I'd need to get the king involved. So I try and do that. White just simplifies. That check isn't so bad. We both try and centralize our kings. And I'm trying to find some way maybe of creating a passed pawn over here, maybe with a g4 break, or maybe I can get an e4 break in. It's not easy though, because also the white rook is cutting off my king from advancing past the 7th rank. White's just stopping my pawn breaks, and then in the meantime moving his own pawn forward, and then the move b7, very classy, right? If I take the rook, then white promotes to a queen. So the only way I've got to try to stop that pawn from promoting is to give this check, which frees a square for the bishop to defend. But after rook to c8, there's not really any good way to prevent this pawn from promoting. Yeah, the pawn's going to promote next move, and I'll have to give up the bishop, and then it'll just be a rook versus a bunch of rather sad looking pawns. So I took a loss in this game from a position where I was actually quite a bit better in the game. I think one of the key lessons is what happened at the start, which actually worked in my favour. Be aware of the thematic tactics. And here I was able to gain an advantage because I did see this thematic tactic. That won a pawn. But then after this move, which I hadn't seen coming, I needed to find the move d5 here. I think the move that I played, rook to c8, was also quite logical. I mean, bring a rook to an open file and prevent the threat that I could see coming. But it didn't see a different move, which I failed to consider, and that was to my cost. And then once that had been played, I needed to admit that I'd been wrong, move the rook out of the way. And then the final mistake, which resulted in me losing the game, was that I didn't find the one way out to save the rook, which was going to be trapped. I needed to be more creative in this moment. I needed to find the move, the one and only move, knight to d5, sacrificing a piece so that I could gain it back. And because I didn't find that, I ended up losing this game and got taught a valuable lesson. So I hope you learned something from this game. If you did and you enjoyed the video, then please drop a like down below. Subscribe to my channel if you want more videos like this one, and do drop a comment down below as well. What did you think of the game, and what did you learn from it? Thanks for watching then. Until next time, I'm Nathan Rose. Bye for now.